From my previous PowerPoint presentation, talked about the relationship between different types of fats and oils and cardiovascular disease risk. I will be getting more in detail about these risks. Just a brief overview of what we talked about in my last PowerPoint presentation about trans fats, saturated fats, and unsaturated fats are the three types of fats that are used and taken and what we're going to be talking about. Trans fats are fats that are taken through a process and that are turned into solids. Saturated fats are molecules that don't have double bonds and that can only be found in butter, cheese, and pork. And at room temperature, these fats are solid. Unsaturated fats have been more loosely packed molecules and they're liquid at room temperature. Now, there are more early research supports the linkage of fats between consumption and cardiovascular disease, which can go back as far as into the 1930s. There are dietary advice from certain health services, but they have shifted focus over time because fat reduction in human diets have reduced and been replaced by other healthier options. The dietary health guidelines in the US and Europe draw its basis from the effects of lipid on the human body. There are more recent suggestions, including removing saturated fats from human diets and replacing them with unsaturated fats to reduce cardiovascular diseases. And as previous as I talked about earlier in the last presentation, the American Heart Association indicates that the use of unsaturated fats can reduce such risk by having unsaturated fats than saturated fats. So just some background information. The most significant advances in research which relate back into the dietary choices of cardiovascular disease was made in the 1960s. Since then, the American Heart Foundation has issued an annual dietary recommendation over the last 50 years. Most of the components have recommendations by the American Heart Association, which draw back points from studies of the same organization other than scholarly works through self-reporting. There has been an average of percent of calories obtained from fats in human diet, which has reduced from the first recommendation of 25% in 1957 and about 6% in 2010. There were still controversial issues that are going on. There were numerous medical and scientific studies which affirm the excessive consumption of fats, which are at high risk for cardiovascular disease. However, there are articles and studies that point that humans can obtain several benefits from consumption of certain types of fats. For example, the AHF, or the American Heart Association, published a study which claims to reduce the amount of saturated fats and replacing them with unsaturated fats, which can reduce coronary heart disease and other complications. Bias on the part of researchers who failed to ensure similar conditions and exposed to all types of fats for everyday participant in this study. Now, there were three different types of cardiovascular disease which were discussed: coronary heart disease, heart failure, and stroke. Just a brief reminder, the symptoms: coronary heart disease. There are symptoms of shortness of breath, discomfort in the chest, pain on the jaw, back, or neck, nausea, lightheadedness, and chest pain. For heart failure, there's shortness of breath, fatigue, history of heart murmurs, enlarged heart, or even diabetes, which includes type 1 and type 2. For stroke, you can get dizzy, loss of balance, difficulty walking, trouble sleeping, trouble seeing in the eyes, one or both, loss of consciousness, confusion, weakness, and difficulty breathing. So for more controversial issues, there are assumptions that human dietary choices and the effects of normal biological function have led researchers to believe that certain types of fats are harmful, while others, specifically use unsaturated fats, have more benefits for the body. There are a few clinical tests to affirm hypotheses which can lead to more issues. Controversies in language between fats and human diet and the risk of cardiovascular disease stem from assumptions in certain research. Going back from my previous presentation, there are consumptions that regard a link between cardiovascular disease, and there is one assumption that biological function and how the human diet affects the process. The assumption has led that researchers conclude that saturated fats are harmful, where unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats, have no health risk in long term. So, some political factors. One of the main political problems is the debate over the consumption of fats, which can lead to cardiovascular disease. There are political concerns over the role of a placebo effect, which in trials that are coming up, which are used to support the beneficial effects of the unsaturated fats. There is a question that I would like everyone to think. What is the exact role of politicians in determining the lifestyle choices and dietary preferences of civilians here in the United States? Which is something to think about. Again, the difference in standards when it comes to different medical approaches continues to create a controversy on which fats are harmful and which ones are healthy. The difference in scientific criteria creates a political controversy that trickles down to certain findings in different studies. Some clinical factors. Cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the modern world. There are about more than 7 million people dying yearly due to these such conditions. One of four deaths in the United States is caused by cardiovascular disease, which is by over-consuming saturated fats than unsaturated fats. Studies in the CDC, as well as other medical experts and scholars, associate the prevalence of cardiovascular disease to human dietary decisions. According to the CDC, more people do not see the need to act on early warning signs of heart-related diseases, and thus when they wait too late, it can lead to possibly death. Cultural factors. Many of the differences in dietary allow and prefer around the world are influenced by ethnicities and cultural beliefs. As stated, different ethnicities are present in difference in cardiovascular disease. According to the finding of the CDC, most of the total deaths due to cardiovascular disease affect Native Americans, non-Hispanic Blacks, and Latinos, which can indicate lifestyle habits which are influenced by individuals' cultural background. There is a need to study more different foods affiliated with the different cultures there are throughout the world and their implications on the prevalence of the risk of cardiovascular disease. The CDC also found that Native Americans or American Indians account as about 18% of the total deaths resulting from cardiovascular disease, whereas non-Hispanic Blacks and non-Hispanic whites account for about 24% risk for cardiovascular disease. There are more social factors that come into play. People can only eat foods that fall within their socioeconomic circles, which means that the price for food become considerations for health risk. There are a high chance of low-income families to be prone to heart disease because they purchase what they can afford, and which normally that these foods contain a high fats and saturated fats. There are socioeconomic factors such as education, occupation, and income levels, which have been linked to the consumption of saturated and unsaturated fats, which have an impact on the prevalence of cardiovascular disease. There has to be more information on better dietary habits, which is also important for those to know the difference between the different types of fats, such as unsaturated and saturated fats. Steps that can lead for action. According to the World Medical Organization, participants in a clinical trial must be informed for all procedural steps and aims of the study, as well as the risk involved in the exercise. Certain inquiries to the implications and appropriate interventions for cardiovascular disease is necessary, which takes steps towards increasing awareness as a medical issue and reducing its prevalence in human society. Appropriate example, this selection is necessary to reduce any risk for bias in clinical trials for cardiovascular disease. Just to wrap things up, Blockage, narrowing, and hardening of major blood vessels, such as the arteries, can lead to common diseases such as coronary heart disease. Excessive uptake of saturated fats contributes to the accumulation of cholesterol in the blood as well as plaque in the arteries, causing cardiovascular complications. Controversies and heated debates continue to emerge regarding the connection between the consumption of different types of fats and the risk of cardiovascular diseases. Based on the past, there are evidence which dietary preferences and lifestyle habits have a direct linkage between to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease amongst humans today. And these are my references.